Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today on J Slay Made in the USA, where we explore truth, expose deception, and inspire courage. Now, I know on my last show I said now through Christmas, I'm only going to do positive, uplifting, and inspiring stories. And hey, we may get there today because anytime you're problem solving, whether it's at a personal level or a geopolitical level, that's a positive thing. So we're gonna go there today. I want this to be a positive show, but at the same time, we're talking about some subjects that are very controversial, and tensions rise when people have opinions on these topics. And that's why I'm so pleased that I have the opportunity for today's guest to come on my show. It's my privilege today to introduce Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a man whose experience and insights make him one of the most important voices, I believe, in today's geopolitical conversation. He's a 30-year Army veteran, and he's proven himself as both a warrior and a thinker. His leadership during the Gulf War, especially in the historic Battle of 73 Easting, demonstrated tactical brilliance that remains studied by military professionals to this day. Beyond the battlefield, he has shaped military strategy through his groundbreaking books, and his expertise has made him a trusted contributor to some of the nation's most prominent news outlets, being a true authority on matters of war and national security. But what truly sets Colonel Macgregor apart is his courage to challenge the prevailing narratives, no matter how unpopular they may be. In an age where blind consensus often leads America into endless and reckless wars, he has stood firm as a voice of dissent, calling for policies rooted in truth and guided by America First interests. Colonel Macgregor is unafraid to point out government manipulations and false pretenses, including the possible use of false flags that often lure the public into supporting unnecessary conflicts. His message is clear and vital. America must break free from foolish entanglements abroad and focus on strengthening and protecting our own nation. At a time when so few leaders are willing to speak uncomfortable truths, Colonel Macgregor's clarity and conviction are a breath of fresh air. With that, thank you so much for coming on today, Colonel. I'm glad to have you.
Hey, that was such a great introduction. I'm going to ensure that you're invited to my funeral because we need someone like you to say some good things about me when everybody else shows up to attack me. So I appreciate it.
Hey, happy to do it. I'll even send you that so you can put it as the preface for other hosts.
Well, maybe, but I think I'm going to save it for the funeral. Great epitaph.
There we go. Yeah, it'll surprise everybody. I'm with you. Well, let's start with the beginning. 2 years ago, I suffered for something. It was the first time as a conservative thinker and contributor that I really questioned a prevailing narrative, because I remember early on in the the Ukraine-Russia, or some would say NATO-Russia conflict, I looked deeper into it, and I began to explore what were the promises we made? What did NATO actually do? What about these biolabs? There were things like that I actually looked into, and I said I can't deny some of these truths that right-wing mainstream media, Fox News and the others, won't really touch. And that's why for a long time, and even to this day, the right and the left wing still have their their Ukraine flags and their lapel pins and all that. Not all of them, but many of them. And I suffered for it when I began to early on be a voice of dissent, saying this might be a nationalist versus a globalist perspective going on here. And if anything, I'm a nationalist. So I'd like you to start. You don't have to tell the whole story all the way through, but give your thoughts on why that war came about, and then what's the lay of the land today.
Well, I'm certainly sympathetic to your position. I can understand it's very tough. Americans, despite the experiences of the last 50, 60 years, continue to largely believe whatever they hear from the mainstream media, which is unfortunate. Now, I think the alternative media has grown in strength, although for a long time, back in 2020 and forward, there was an effort to essentially put alternative media out of business. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, it's come roaring back, thank goodness, because it's really one of the few sources of truthful reporting that we have. Because everything that comes through the mainstream media outlets, not just here in the United States, but also in Great Britain, in France, and Germany, and many other countries, is hopelessly slanted in favor of a narrative. So you don't have truth anymore. You have narratives.
Right.
And so you're asking me, literally, what's the truth versus what the narrative says? Because we hear every day repeated this crazy lie that Russia's intervention in eastern Ukraine was an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state. Woof, woof, woof. No, that's not true. And you got to, we could spend a lot of time going all the way back, but the key point is this: that in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and its allied structure, if you want to call it that, its satellites collapsed, the communist parties in all of the Eastern European states all fell apart. They fell apart for a whole range of reasons. People like to say, well, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. I would tell you that socialism, as practiced by the Russians and others, was so self-defeating and dysfunctional, it was going to fall apart one way or the other. Undoubtedly, we contributed to the acceleration of that fall in some ways, but it was doomed. When it fell apart, one of the things that came up for discussion when the German government at the time was literally buying back German territory and population from the Soviet Union. They were paying billions of marks in order to induce the Soviets to leave Eastern Germany. At one point, Chancellor Kohl at the time was actually offered East Prussia, which is what the Russians call Kaliningrad, which is now a huge problem for NATO, sitting on the Baltic. But Kaliningrad, which was Königsberg in German, that had been a German territory and population for 1,000 years. So when the Soviets pulled out, they were desperate for hard cash, hard money. And they were offering lots of things for sale. This also extended, by the way, in some places to nuclear weapons, which is why the Soviets invited us in to help them get control of their own nuclear arsenal to prevent theft and essentially marketing on the black market of low-yield nuclear warheads. It was a very crazy time.
Mm-hmm.
But Gorbachev, who was the president at the time, and then subsequently his successor Yeltsin also said these things. But Gorbachev said, look, we're going to pull out, but we'd like your promise that whatever happens once we pull out, you will not advance the border of NATO to our borders. In other words, we want something between NATO and us.
Right.
And that would have meant Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, and so forth. Those states would probably never have entered NATO under that understanding. And then suddenly the Soviet Union broke up into these fragmentary organizations. One, Belarusia, White Russia, has about 8 million people in it. Ukraine, which was much larger at the time, almost 50 million. That suddenly became an independent state, even though Ukraine has never been an independent nation state in the history of Europe. It's a region that has largely been under other people's control. And you can go back 300 years and it was under Polish-Lithuanian control for centuries. And then eventually, as Polish-Lithuanian power ebbed and fell apart, and there were wars that were fought, Russian power advanced further and further to the west. And in most cases, they surrendered territory to the Russians on the basis of treaties and money exchanged.
Okay.
So it's at some point then, about 300 years ago, the Russians ended up in control of Kiev, which had for hundreds of years been a Polish-Lithuanian outpost. The only reason I'm bringing this up is that we have to understand that boundaries, territorial boundaries, borders, if you will, have changed in that part of the world routinely over hundreds of years. Anybody who tells you that the borders in Europe are all fixed is probably on crack. They never have been and they never will be. So the point is that this thing we call Ukraine was not really all Ukrainian. The eastern part was populated largely with Russians. So was Odessa in the south. In some areas, you had Tatars, Mongol Turkic people.
Mm-hmm.
In other areas, you had people that were really Polish in origin. The point is, this was not a homogeneous state on the model of what we saw after the Second World War. But at the time, the Russians were weak and had been reduced to poverty. Their economy had crashed. There wasn't much they could do about this. And what emerges is this thing we call Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ukraine then became very quickly one of the largest organized crime states in the world, and it still is. It's a place that swims in corruption, brutality, on a scale that we can't even begin to grasp here in this country. It's a center for human trafficking in children and women, drug transmission, on and on and on. Now, as Russia recovered, it began to watch us advance the border of NATO, which we said we would not advance. And the Russians did raise objections. They said, well, if you move into Poland, which happened in 1999, that puts you very close to us. Don't move into Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And remember, Estonia in the north borders Russia.
Yes.
Lithuania and Latvia border White Russia. The point is, they said, well, wait a minute, this is getting too close for comfort. And they began to watch us and our behavior in the international arena. We were very aggressive. We saw ourselves as the only superpower left standing. And this was our golden opportunity to create a new world order, as enunciated by President Bush,
Yeah. Right.
and impose that order on the world, which we thought would be grateful for the order.
Right.
Well, that didn't turn out to be the case. But in the meantime, the Russians are watching all of this happen. This man, Putin, comes to power, and he says Russia is prostrate. Russia is being plundered. Russia is being exploited. We've got to stop it. And that's what he did. He stopped Russia from being plundered by foreigners, principally Americans and some West Europeans and Brits and others. And Russia suddenly began to regain a sense of itself.
Mm-hmm.
As it regained a sense of itself, it also began trying to reform, reorganize, and build its armed forces, try to make it effective, because the Russians had trouble putting together just a few brigades and say 3, 4, 5,000 men. Suddenly now Putin said, no, we've got to build a force. We're one of the largest countries in the world. We have longer borders than anybody else. We're going to need something. So we've got to do better. We, in the meantime, continued to ignore this plea from the Russians. Please don't advance into Ukraine. Please don't try to advance into Georgia, which also has a border with us. In other words, don't go to these countries that border us.
Mm-hmm.
Try to turn them into hostile platforms for attack against Russia. It became increasingly obvious that that's exactly what we were going to do. Then you had these meetings in NATO. One was in Budapest, and we suddenly announced that it was the long-term intention of the United States and its allies for this place called Ukraine to become part of NATO. Well, this rang alarm bells all up and down Russia, saying, my God, what do they want to be there for? This doesn't make any sense. The United States and its allies have never had any strategic interests in Ukraine. We are the ones with a strategic interest in Ukraine because Ukraine is the preferred route of invasion into Russia, and historically, it's the highway for the Mongolian armies to move from Asia into Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what happens in Ukraine is of vital strategic interest to the Russian people.
Right.
And they are, after all, Slavs like us. Their language, their culture, their history is inextricably intertwined with us.
Colonel, can I ask you a quick question as you're going through this timeline? Yeah. And I think this is important. When you say Russia was regaining a sense of itself, Putin, whether he was in power, I don't think he was in the mid 90s yet, but he was watching all of this, right? He was seeing all this happen from the time he was a boy. I've had very pro-Ukrainian guys on my show, like in terms of, this battle with NATO and everything, who say Putin's just a complete thug, guys who would take Sebastian Gorka's approach. And they've told me that Putin is a closet Soviet, and really Russia getting a sense of itself would be going back to the old style Russia with communism and the gulags and everything else. I don't see it that way. What's your quick take before you continue on this timeline through Putin's eyes?
Russia today is what it was before the First World War.
Okay.
It's a country that rests on the foundation of Christian Orthodox religion and culture. Russia is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world. What's really amazing about Russia is that it could have lived for 70 years under communism. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as communism fell apart and the Communist Party was expelled from power, almost overnight, the nation celebrated its Christian roots. Mm. So I would say, to be frank, everyone who lived in Eastern Europe under communism was affected by it. Everyone. Mm-hmm. You could not live in that part of the world without being influenced in some way, good or bad, by communism. And I think Putin said it best. He said, anyone who does not regret the dissolution of the Soviet Union has no heart. He said, on the other hand, anybody who wants to bring it back has no brain.
Okay,
And
right.
I think that's how you have to understand Putin. He's a Russian nationalist. And so he's got a foot in Tsarist Russia. He's got a foot in the Soviet Union. But this is also a man who lived for years in Germany and had traveled in the West and knew what the West was and what it offered, and came to power as probably the single most pro-Western leader that Russia has had since Tsar Nicholas II.
Well, that's something you're not going to hear in conservative
No.
media or liberal media.
And the problem that he's had over and over and over again is that he thought he was going to form a relationship with the West that would ultimately result in Russia joining NATO. He actually asked President Bush about it. He raised it again with President Obama. You know, this is not what we think. And people say, well, he was in the KGB. Well, I guess that could be similar to, well, you worked for the CIA,
Right.
so therefore you're bad. I don't think that holds water. I think that's nonsense. Now, he's a tough, highly intelligent, well-educated man. This is no fool. You don't come to power in a place like Russia or China or any number of other countries in the world unless you know what you're doing, unless you're very competent and you're tough and you're ruthless. There's no question about it. But this is not a man who is in search of war. And the last thing he wants is to expand the country. And why is that? He's a great admirer of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Some of your
Yes.
audience may recall this man. And he awarded Alexander Solzhenitsyn one of the highest prizes for his work that could be awarded in the Russian nation. And he believed strongly in everything that Solzhenitsyn said. And Solzhenitsyn was always adamant about, we Russians need to be Russians. Let's let all these people who are not Russians go away.
Right.
In other words, give them their freedom, their independence. We should be friends with them, but we don't want to rule them. So you have all of these new countries that have emerged in Central Asia that used to be part of, frankly, the Golden Horde and the Mongolian armies. That's where they came from, Central Asia. The Russians want to be friends with them, and fortunately, most of their leaders and their governments and their people see wisdom in being friendly with Russia. So Russia has a very important role to play in promoting stability and suppressing Islamist terror and Islamist extremism in Central Asia. Now, having said all of that, he's constantly attacked and demonized, but that's what we do to everyone we don't like. I mean, we just understand that. I mean, I'm demonized.
Right.
They're demonizing Tulsi Gabbard.
Mm-hmm.
They demonize anyone who contradicts the narrative. And the narrative is Russia is bad, Putin is bad, and it's a danger to us, and we must fight it. No, that's wrong. Russia presents no danger to us. Yes, it has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, but it's not interested in going to war. If you listen to Sergei Lavrov the other night with Tucker Carlson, he said, we don't want a nuclear war under any circumstances,
Right.
and we're not going to use those. We seem to have selective hearing. We want to hear what satisfies us and supports our narrative. The narrative is false. We're engaged in trying to harm Russia everywhere possible, and to a large extent, we're engaged in something similar against China and Iran and many other countries when it's not really necessary, when these places don't represent threats to us. So the bottom line is that in 2014, we staged a coup. The CIA set it up, and we installed a puppet government in Kiev. And this puppet government was unambiguously hostile to Russia. And the one thing that Russia is not going to tolerate is a government in Ukraine that is hostile to Russia, because Ukraine sits literally on the doorstep. I would say this is analogous to Mexico City falling into the hands of, say, Chinese puppets or Russian puppets, and then watching Chinese and Russian military power, advisors, technicians, and technology pour into Mexico, and watch this new army in Mexico, a new Air Force in Mexico, build up in Guadalajara, just over the border, with only one possible purpose in mind: to attack the United States. And this is exactly what happened. And as soon as this puppet government was installed, they began attacking, physically attacking, not just suppressing as they had previously, but now physically attacking the Russian population in eastern Ukraine. And before the war even broke out, they'd killed at least 15,000 Russian men, women, and children in eastern Ukraine by constantly shelling them with artillery and attacking them. And naturally, the people there defended themselves and begged for Russian help, and the Russians would not come in. They said, no, we have to make peace. You've got to make peace with the Ukrainians. And finally, it became clear that it didn't matter what the Russians who were living in eastern Ukraine did. They were always going to be oppressed. They were going to be third-class citizens. And if they didn't agree to, quote unquote, become Ukrainians, they would face expulsion or death. So eventually, you get this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was supposed to commit the United States and Germany and France and other countries to alleviate this oppression of Russians in Ukraine, to ensure there's some sort of legal system that treats everyone equal before the law. Stop, badgering and bullying and the Ukrainians. And we know from Chancellor Merkel, she admitted the whole thing was a front. It was just a facade to get the Ukrainian military ready to fight Russia. And by the time the Russians intervened, that force was pretty substantial, very well trained, very well equipped, better than the Russians appreciated. And that force was readying to attack Russia, to regain Ukrainian control of the Crimea, even though Crimea had never been part of Ukraine throughout its entire history. It was a Mongol Tartar Khanate. It was under the Ottoman Empire, and then it was taken by Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia, and had been Russia since 1776. But in a little sort of drunken brawl at Khrushchev's dacha somewhere, he decided, in the midst of being inebriated, to give his buddies in the Communist Party of Ukraine Crimea as a gift. Thank you for your help and supporting me. Well, the truth is, the communists that ran Ukraine weren't really Ukrainian either. They were Russians. The whole thing was a fraud. But we're stuck with this construct, and you have this silly notion. Well, yet Ukraine has to regain all of its territory and regain Crimea and everything else. First of all, that's never going to happen. And secondly, that was really never Ukrainian anyway. But Americans don't know that. The narrative doesn't mention that.
Right.
The Russians went in there and they discovered this was a much bigger force than we had entertained. In other words, that we had anticipated. And Russia is constantly being accused of wanting to conquer Eastern Europe. Well, their army was too small to deal with the Ukrainian forces in Eastern Ukraine. So after a few months, they had to go over to the strategic defense, which begins really in the fall of 2022 and then continues into much of 2023. Well, why did they do that? Because their army needed to expand. They needed to bring on reservists. They needed to bring in new recruits. They had to start up factories to produce new equipment. In other words, the small army that Russia had, that included, out of some 400,000 men, 132,000 draftees every year, that thing was not in any condition to do much more than defend Russia's borders.
And where are we at in the timeline here? What
well, this is 2014, 2015,
okay. I was making sure we're still there.
Okay. And then you go in Russia in 2022 and they discover this army's too small, can't do it. They have to go to the strategic defense. But at the same time, there was an attempt to negotiate an end to the fighting. The Russians didn't want to fight. They wanted to find a way out of this and that would secure their national interests in Ukraine and protect the Russians who lived there. We sabotaged that. It was rejected in April of 2022. Remember, Boris Johnson flew in and said, no, we don't want you to negotiate an end to this. And we promised this little government in Ukraine, our puppet, and their supporters, we will give you everything you need and you will defeat Russia. You will have the entire scientific industrial power of the United States and Western Europe and NATO behind you. You can't lose. Stick with us. Well, that didn't work. And they've lost over 600,000 dead on the battlefield fighting the Russians. I don't know how many other hundreds of thousands are wounded. I've heard people talk about 1.4, 1.5 million casualties in Ukraine lost to the war. And of course, we lie and we say, oh, no, the Ukrainians have had very few casualties. Well, if they've had very few casualties, how did they lose an area that's the size of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia, which is basically what the Russians currently control, and it continues to be lost. And they say the Russians have taken hundreds of thousands of casualties and can't do anything right, and they're incompetent. But there's no evidence for that. The opposite is true. And what's really striking about this war is that the Russians have been very, very concerned about their own soldiers. historically, there was never much concern about how many Russian lives were lost. In this war, it's being
Hmm.
acutely felt by Putin, his government, and the people. And at the same time, they've tried very, very hard to avoid killing anybody in Ukraine that did not fight them. In other words, they wanted to spare civilian losses, and they've done a pretty good job. But the point is that today the Russians are about to stand on the Dnieper River. And if you look at the map, Kiev is on the Dnieper, and everything west of the Dnieper is historically Western Ukraine, and everything east of the Dnieper is Eastern Ukraine, or was, and those areas are historically Russian.
Okay.
Now, that means we're nearing the end of this war, except that we continue to send just enough materiel that can be operated and supported by Americans and others not in uniform, but as contractors, to create the illusion that there is still fight left in the Ukrainian body. Right now, Ukraine is a comatose body lying on the slab,
Right.
and it's on life support. And we keep giving it a haircut and a shave and telling them, "Oh, this is great. Ukraine's going to win just a little bit more, and it will win." No, it's over. It's dead. The Ukrainian nation itself is being killed. You've gone from 40 million people living in that country down to maybe 18 million at this point under the Kiev government, if that. Millions have left, will never go back, and have made it very clear they'll never go back. So this
Is
is
the
a disaster for us and for Western civilization.
is the philosophy of the current warmongers in the West, specifically in America, that want to pump lots more money and weapons and everything else, the long range weapons now to fire into Russia. Is it still about the New World Order that George Bush Sr. was talking about all those years ago, where we've got to get everybody in alignment to create this global power structure? Is that ultimately the philosophy that's driving this?
I think on one level it is, but it's more in a more specific way. I think it is simply this thing they call the post-war liberal international order is simply the financial, political, and economic order that we established that benefits us.
Okay.
And that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for that degree of political, economic, and military hegemony that gives us control of the world that we think is important. Now, the truth is, most of the world is walking away from us and already has. And that's the point of the so-called BRICS: the Brazil,
Right.
Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. They've got 84 countries lined up to join. They want to join a gold-backed currency system. They want to join a system that does not put them at our mercy. And why is it important to them? Well, every time somebody gives us money and we sell them a bond, we pass our debt on to them. In other words, the current state of affairs that allows us to run around and pretend that we're solvent with a $35 trillion national sovereign debt is the financial system itself. And that's why you're hearing Donald Trump make very, very stupid and dangerous statements. If you don't use dollars, then we'll punish you. Well, the problem is that we're reaching a point now where our sanctions don't matter, tariffs won't work, because the world is finding a way to trade and do business without us.
Right.
And that includes Saudi Arabia.
So I saw the recent tweet from Trump about if anyone tries to use anything other than the Federal Reserve dollar or go with the BRICS nations, we're going to punish you. I mean, I forget the exact language. And then you've
That's
got a
right.
guy like Sebastian Gorka, who he just appointed to his cabinet, that made some claims that, I mean, at this point, based on the story that you're telling me about what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and the loss of life there, and that, I mean, you were saying 4 months ago, I remember you were doing an interview, you said this war is over. They cannot win. They've already lost 400,000 lives. Now I think you said 500 or 600,000. I've seen the videos of young men being pulled from their homes to go fight on the front lines, knowing they're probably going to die. I mean, it's horribly sad to watch. Sebastian Gorka should know better. What is the deal?
I'll give one tip away that the president has mentioned. He will say to that murderous former KGB colonel, that thug who runs the Russian Federation, you will negotiate now, or the aid that we have given to Ukraine thus far will look like peanuts. That's how he will force those gentlemen to come to an arrangement that stops the bloodshed.
Well, it's not a question of knowing better. He signed on for the narrative. You have to understand that people on the Hill, people like Sebastian Gorka and others, they've signed on for the narrative that ensures their employment, that they will make money, that they have a place. And that's what it's all about. Everybody on the Hill is in receipt of cash from some lobby.
Right.
Now, how do they get that? That's a long story, but it's what I would call legalized graft. And this has been going on forever. And these are the people that control everything. If you go to the Hill and you say, the Russians have a good reason for what they've done. In other words, that Russia's cause is just. Russia doesn't want to invade Western Europe, has no interest in doing that at all. It wants to do business with Western Europe. It wants to do business with us. Right. They just want to be sure that the people that border their country are not hostile to them. They're worried about that. And they have a 1,000-year history that informs them of the consequences of what happens when your neighbors are hostile. And Ukraine is unambiguously hostile. And we have cultivated that. We've promoted that. And we installed this government to weaponize it. So they want an end to this. And they want a neutral Ukraine, much like Austria, or much as Finland was. And these neutral states flourished. Austria flourished in particular as a result of becoming neutral in 1955. They walked out of the West and said, look, we don't want to be part of your wars. We don't want to be part of NATO. We don't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact. And they developed this state treaty that met everybody's concerns and interests. There are no U.S. bases in Austria. There are no NATO troops in Austria. And Austria now, for the first time in its history, has a higher standard of living than the Germans, which has never been the case in the past. So they've flourished. They've profited economically, socially, culturally. That could happen for Ukraine. But it can't happen if Ukraine is a satellite of the United States and NATO as a launching pad for attacks against Russia. That's all this is about. It has nothing to do with conquering Western Europe. That's all nonsense.
Let's fast forward the tape in two directions. We'll play a little Back to the Future here. One is, what is the best possible scenario at this? Well, let's do that one second. The first is, let's say Sebastian Gorka gets his way and the others that would be aligned with her, getting paid off or however it is through lobbying and other means to continue to tell Ukraine to do our bidding. We're going to send you money and weapons, et cetera. What is the end game of that if they keep going and pressing forward for, say, another year, versus what would you do if you were in charge?
Well, first of all, not only will more Ukrainians die, but everything that is east of the Dnieper River, which essentially bisects Ukraine, that will be permanently Russian. There will be no discussion or negotiation of who can live where. And there's a very high probability that the Russian armed forces will advance all the way to the Polish border, which they don't want to do. They don't want to border NATO. In other words, they would much rather have neutral Ukraine and let Ukraine be a bridge between Russia and Central Asia and Europe in terms of commerce and business and so forth.
Okay.
And if that's what we want, then we need to stay on the current path. Now, between now and the time when they reach the Polish border, given the hostility that I hear from people like Gorka, there's a distinct possibility that you could end up at war with Russia. And if you end up at war with Russia, you are going to be at war with China.
Mm-hmm.
That's unambiguously clear. They are permanently linked, not because of any ideological beliefs, but because it's mutually beneficial economically, commercially. Russia has lots of things the Chinese need. The Chinese produce many of the things that they used to buy in the West that they now buy from China.
Right.
They both border Central Asia. Both of them have an interest in keeping Central Asia calm and stable. So you'll end up at war with both of those states. I don't think that that's a war we can win, nor do I think it's a war that we need to fight. But if you push this to the edge, that's where you'll end up. There's no question about it.
What do you see as, and you may have already answered this and I might have missed it, but how do we disengage most appropriately to, one, save lives and not do any more damage to either side and end in somewhat of an amicable fashion?
Before President Trump made some of these ill-considered statements and hired somebody like Sebastian Gorka, who's anxious to bloviate in public to puff up his own image, claiming that what he is saying is what Trump has said to him. I mean, that's kind of an unusual set of circumstances. Normally, those of us who work for the president for any length of time. Do not go into the public forum and say, well, the president told me in my discussion with the president, he said the following and he's right. You know, that's nonsense. I don't know what President Trump told him, but I know what President Trump has said in the past. And he has said repeatedly, he said, I just want the killing in Ukraine to stop.
Mm-hmm.
He's tried to make it clear that he is not anti-Russian, that he's not anti-Ukrainian. He just wants the killing to stop. Well, that's a good position to take. And the quickest way to do that is to suspend all military aid immediately to Ukraine. Stop it. Ukraine won't last 2 or 3 days without that military aid. They won't last without hundreds of millions of dollars of cash that go into their private bank accounts. You look at the people at the top in Ukraine that are running the show in the military and the political structure, they're all now multimillionaires. I think Zelensky is probably a billionaire.
Yeah.
They've been enriched by this corrupt practice in Washington of creating a puppet state. And the people in Ukraine are worse off now than they've ever been. So that's the number one. Got to suspend all the aid. Number two, we need to get all U.S. military personnel in or out of uniform, intelligence personnel in or out of uniform, out of Ukraine. They need to leave.
Mm-hmm.
If those two things happen, the fighting will stop. And then there's an opportunity to talk. And we as Americans, as the leaders in NATO, could host a conference. Now, that conference should involve, as a minimum, the states that border Russia, that have an interest in what happens in Ukraine. And I'm talking about Poland and Hungary and Slovakia, as well as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Certainly, you can invite Romania for the same reason. I think the Germans should be part of this because the Germans have long-standing trade, commercial relations with Russia that go back hundreds of years. All of them have an interest in stability and prosperity in Central East Europe. We could host that conference, and then we could ask the various parties to present their proposals, their solutions. And this could last several weeks, or it could last a month or several months, but that's where you hammer out a solution. But the first way to get there is to stop the fighting. You stop the fighting by stopping the aid.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. You know, we spent 35 minutes on just Ukraine and Russia. How much time do I have you?
Well, you've got another 25 minutes, but let's just finish up by saying that this war could end quickly. President Trump was a bit hyperbolic when he said in 24 hours. That's not true. But it could certainly end within a few days if we were to follow that prescription. Because otherwise, this will go on. And right now, the Ukrainian army in the field is evaporating. It's just disintegrating.
Unbelievable.
And whenever armies disintegrate at the end of wars, this happened to the Germans in the last 6 months of the war. The Germans took more casualties in the last 8 months than they did in the entire war. And that's what's happening right now on the ground in Ukraine. Thousands of Ukrainian troops are being slaughtered and killed. They can't retreat to anything. They have no new places to occupy.
There's got to be an
little
incredible
holdouts and pockets, but there's nothing left. So we want this to stop.
Yeah.
We're killing off the manhood of the country. There will be no Ukraine after this if we're not careful. In fact, a lot of people think that's going to happen anyway. So it needs to stop. So if President Trump wants the killing to stop, that's the first step. And then step number 2 is to get us out of there. What would we do if there were several thousand Russian or Chinese technical advisors with a large Mexican army sitting in Guadalajara, just south of our border? And we fought, for whatever it is, 3 years to drive this force out of there. And there was no hope. The Mexicans were defeated and prostrate. There's nothing to stop us from marching into Mexico City. But we don't want to go to Mexico City. No one in their right mind wants to go to Mexico City. The Russians are not stupid. They don't want to go into Western Ukraine. They know the people in Western Ukraine don't want to be ruled by them. They want the Europeans to take control and sort this out with them. And that can be done.
Yes.
We can host it, but we can't cut a deal, quote unquote, with Russia that divides the world as we see fit. That's not going to happen. This is a region of the world that's vitally important, Everybody in the region has to be involved, specifically the states that I mentioned to you. But the first step is to say it's over. We're not supporting, we're not funding, no more aid. And then secondly, we Americans are getting completely out of there.
Right. That's good. Well, when it comes to all of the World War theater right now between the Middle East and Russia, I've got more confidence in Trump regarding Russia and Ukraine, just because I think he's not as committed to any kind of war there, even though I don't like some of his cabinet choices and the personnel as policy. You've said that before. But if we flip it over to the Middle East, I have some pretty serious concerns. When October 7th first happened, everybody had, their hearts sank into their stomach just based on what they heard. But I knew this could be something deeper is going on here. I knew for a long time about the Greater Israel Project after I had been looking into the history of Israel. And then I started to research the history of Hamas and different things. And I just thought there's something more going on here than we're being told, as is usually the case when it comes to war like this. And then I began to see Jerusalem Post and Times of Israel, and they would put out reports that, Mossad and the secret services of Israel, they kind of knew this was coming. They didn't really do anything about it. They held off support in a little tiny country where you can get anywhere with air support within 15 minutes for 6 hours and let it happen. So I'll stop talking there because I want to get your take now, kind of like you did with Ukraine, Russia. You don't have to give us the whole history, but leading up to October 7th and then to today, give us your lay of the land.
Well, if we go back over the history that leads up to October 7th, that's
it's a whole nother podcast. I understand.
I think it's important to understand something. There's been a lot of injustice meted out to the Arabs that live inside Israel, the Palestinian Arabs. That's true. The Israelis suffered injustices. Israel was created as a result of a great injustice called the Holocaust, which is why I and probably millions of others in the United States, especially Great Britain, have been very sympathetic to the Israelis. I certainly have been. And the Israel that I see today is not the Israel that I saw in the 20 years or so that I have visited that place. And I've been going to Israel since January of 1999 every few years. And I have a very high opinion of the military leadership of that country, as well as the intelligence leadership. And I had actually visited southern Israel, saw Gaza from the outside, from the Israeli vantage point, saw how they secure it and what they've done. And I can tell you that based on my brief tenure there and experience, that nothing could happen inside that Gaza Strip without the Israelis knowing it, to the point where if a Palestinian took a shot at an Israeli soldier in the tower, within 2 minutes they knew who he was, where he lived, and who his family was. That's right. The level of visibility that they had. So when this happened, I was immediately shocked, and like you and like many others, I was appalled at the descriptions of the things that were done. Now, in retrospect, we know that a lot of what was reported was not, in fact, accurate. That doesn't excuse it or make it better, but it wasn't what they said. There were no babies being decapitated and so forth and so on. But having said that, more and more information has come out of Israel from people directly saying that, yes, we knew it was coming and we reported it. There was a group of Israeli women. I think there's a group of maybe 5 or 6 or 7. And the Israelis, and I don't want to go into detail, but they're very intelligent in the way they handle the draft army that they've got. Mm-hmm. They try to put the people where they can do most good for the short period that they're on active duty. And these women were picked for their brains and their understanding and their language abilities. And their whole mission was to monitor the Gaza Strip and whatever happened in it. And they reported that these things were gelling. It looked ominous and something was coming. Then the day before, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence of the Egyptian Army directly called the intelligence leadership in Israel and said, there's an attack. It's coming tomorrow. It looks terrible. And we think it's going to resemble this, and basically described what then subsequently happened. And you're right. When I was there, they had reaction forces on the ground and in the air that in no time could be dispatched to blunt this sort of thing. So unfortunately, I've reached the conclusion that this was Mr. Netanyahu's dream come true, because this, in his mind, enabled him to pull off the shelf this plan, you call it for Greater Israel, and that's probably an accurate statement, I would say, for the mass murder and expulsion of all Palestinian Arabs
Yeah.
from what these people consider to be Israel. That means everybody in the West Bank out, everybody inside Israel out, everybody in the Gaza Strip out. And we've been underwriting this thing. And I've lost a lot of friends in Israel, and the IDF said, "You're not with us on this?" And I said, "No, I'm not."
Yeah.
I said, I don't see anything good coming from this for Israel.
Right.
Well, we'll see. You're wrong. We'll see. I would not support this if all the people living in Gaza were Jewish. I wouldn't support it if all the people living in Gaza were Chinese. Do you understand?
I totally.
Mass murder and expulsion, to me as an American, is something I'm uncomfortable with.
100%.
So, I'm not anti-Israeli. I would like to see this end. But the tragedy now is that so much blood is being spilled and so many things have been said and done that there's no way back. And it's become a life or death proposition for the Israelis, I'm afraid.
I agree. And one thing that I thought from the beginning is even before Israel sent its first bomb with their artificial intelligence bombing platforms, which those names like the Gospel and Where's Daddy, very interesting they would choose that. But I knew this is going to be really bad, really fast, because I knew the kind of military capability that Israel has, especially with the U.S. as its backer and funder and weapons provider, et cetera.
Well, if I could just interrupt.
Sure.
Over the years, we cultivated the emergence in Egypt and Jordan of governments that were essentially almost puppet governments of the West, who would then get along with, cooperate with the Israelis. Now, this began with the 73 war, and the war ended very positively, in my judgment, because the Egyptians regained their national self-respect, received land, in return for which the Israelis got peace on their borders. Now, we interrupted an election, disrupted the process, and ensured that an Islamist who had come to power in Egypt would not stay in office. And that person, I think his name was Morsi, he was removed and replaced by Sisi, the Egyptian general. And he has tried everything within his power to avoid conflict with the Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
So has King Abdullah in Jordan. The one outlier, of course, is Syria, the government in Syria, and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Now, things don't look good right now in Egypt or Jordan. The populations there are violently angry about what's being done to millions of Arabs and Muslims like themselves. And I should introduce the word Christian, because large numbers of the people that are being killed in Syria as well as in the Gaza Strip are Christians.
Mm-hmm.
We don't seem to bring that up. 30% of the people killed or wounded in and around Beirut were Christians. So this is not exclusively a Muslim versus Israeli war.
And many of these sites in Gaza and Beirut and other places are not only the people a good proportion Christian, but they're some of the most historic sites for
yes.
the Christian faith, right?
Well, you've got to understand from the Israeli standpoint, their track record, they say, is bad with Christians in the region, that the Christians usually support the Muslim governments under which they live. Of course, my response to that is, well, if you're going to be a Christian and live in Syria or Iraq or anywhere else, how do you live there if you're not a good citizen and support the government? But that doesn't come up for discussion.
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is that Syria is an outlier, and so is Lebanon. Now, the Israelis went into Lebanon. They took heavy losses. The Israeli Defense Force is exhausted. They didn't capture any villages per se or any significant ground, but they did manage to bomb the population and Hezbollah out of the area, so that Hezbollah had to retire north and reorganize itself. But Hezbollah is not gone; it's wounded.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelis, on the other hand, they're in a very tight position because they've taken losses in Gaza and losses against Hezbollah. And they don't have a very large manpower pool from which to draw. So they're heavily dependent upon Air Force capabilities to bomb extensively. Right now, Syria looks like it's on the verge of falling apart. And what has happened is that Islamists, the offspring and descendants of Al-Qaeda, were repurposed by us.
Mm-hmm.
We took them, trained them, equipped them, and prepared them in this area called Idlib under Turkish protection for future use. When Senator John McCain went over to visit, a lot of people were upset when he came back and he had his picture taken with people that were all part of Al-Qaeda, whom he congratulated as being our friends and allies.
Mm-hmm.
These people were also friends and allies of Israel because the Mossad has been in there. And so it is a question of American, Israeli intelligence, influence, money, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We're providing that directly to these Islamists. These are the people that decapitate people, the people that engage in mass rapes and all these other things that you've heard about from ISIS, same group.
Yep.
And the Turks, of course, are very interested in it because it's a cheap way, in their judgment, to gain control of more territory in Syria. Because Mr. Erdogan, he's close to the end of his life, and he wants to have a legacy of having expanded Turkey because he has this fascination with the Ottoman past.
Okay.
So he wants to expand into northern Syria, and he hates Bashar Assad because he's not a Sunni Muslim. He's an Alawite Shiite. And I'm afraid that the Syrian army was lackadaisical, complacent, and surprised. So now the Russians and the Iranians have to intervene in Syria because they cannot tolerate the destruction of Syria and the elimination of Syria as a link between Iran and Lebanon and the Mediterranean. The same thing is true for Russia. Russia has an outpost on the Mediterranean there, a significant harbor, has significant assets there. They don't want to lose those. So they're in the game of catch-up, which is usually something we play. Now they're playing catch-up to try and rectify the situation. I don't know if it can be quickly rectified because a lot of these places took years to retake from ISIS to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see the same organization back there. So it'll be interesting to see what results from this. But this is very much in the interest of Israel's expansion because the Israelis have their eyes on southern Syria.
Right.
And it's interesting to note that the spearheads of this Islamist army have completely ignored Israel and the Golan Heights and have shifted south in the direction of Jordan. And you see, Mr. Erdogan and his friends have been very interested in destabilizing Jordan because, again, Jordan was part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, at some point, if all of this were to succeed, then I suspect these various groups and Mr. Erdogan, if he's still around, would turn on Israel. In other words, once they've united with us and the Israelis to dispose of their enemies, then they would turn back against us.
Mm-hmm.
This is the nature of the beast in that part of the world. And we, of course, are doing everything we can to help this, thinking that this is good for Israel. Well, perhaps in the short run, it benefits Israel, but in the long run, I think it's suicidal.
Would you agree with aspects, or maybe even all of this following statement? The secret services, not all, but some of the government interests of both the United States and Israel there's a sophisticated evil and then there's barbaric evil, and sophisticated evil knows how to use barbaric evil. So I would call the Hamas guys that came in and did what they did, the reality of what it was, is evil. And Israel
remember that Hamas was a creature of the Mossad.
Yes.
That Netanyahu was instrumental in standing up Hamas as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank.
Right.
And the Israelis are always trying, and they have reasons for doing this. I'm not criticizing them for it, but it's a hazardous policy. If they see division somewhere amongst their neighbors, they want to exaggerate it. They want to cultivate it. They want to expand it. And so anything they do where it divides the various Muslim, Arab, Iranian, Turkish elements that live in the region, from their standpoint, is good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a double-edged sword, though. And what they found now is Hamas, which was stood up as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, is now the rock star of the Muslim world. And they have not destroyed Hamas. Hamas is being wounded and is weakened. But just like Hezbollah, there are innumerable numbers of people lining up to join.
Right.
These organizations are seen as patriotic,
right.
God-loving entities that are fighting the evil Israeli infidel, which is regarded by most of them as a colonial entity, foreign to the region. I mean, this is the way people look at things. I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying this is the way they look at things.
What is your estimate? Because this has been incredibly hard to know who to trust on estimates, and both sides of the media will tell you can't trust the numbers that come from the Hamas medical authorities or whatever. But the number of casualties on both sides at this point in the Middle Eastern conflict, where would you put it at? And I know it might be a bit of a guess.
Well, first of all, you're right. Anything that I say will be discounted by the Israelis as Arab disinformation.
Right.
And anything that the Israelis say will be quickly attacked, not just by Arabs, but by many others, as simply false. Last night in the discussion between Tucker Carlson and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Tucker asked a question about Russian casualties. And he said, when we're in a war, we don't discuss those publicly. By the way, during World War II and Korea, we didn't discuss those things.
Right.
And we slow rolled bad news. Very few people know that in the first 24 hours of the so-called Battle of the Bulge, which was called by the Germans the Ardennes Offensive, 25,000 Americans surrendered to the advancing Germans.
Wow.
You ever hear that?
No.
No, nobody brings it up. We took very heavy losses in the Bulge, and we lied, and we said the Germans took the heavy losses.
Right.
We were the ones that took the heavy losses, not the Germans. In fact, we know their exact figures. They had 11,000 killed and a total of 68,000 casualties. We had over 120,000 casualties and more than 25,000 killed. Well, why didn't we tell the truth? Well, what would the truth have done to FDR in the White House? People by December of 44 wanted the war over.
Mm-hmm.
Americans never wanted to fight in Europe to begin with. So you're going to tell them now we have all these heavy casualties? Come on.
Yeah.
So everybody lies. So if you're asking me, Lancet, a British journal, said that 189,000 people in Gaza were killed or wounded. How many were killed of the 189,000? I don't know. But 189,000 casualties. I think they're being honest. I think Lancet's a pretty reliable source.
Okay.
In Lebanon, 30,000 people killed or wounded, maybe more. Most of it from bombing. Some of it in the clashes with the IDF in the south. Did the Hezbollah lose 1,000 people? I don't know. Could have. How many people did the Israelis lose? 100? 200? How many hundreds were wounded? I don't know. But one thing is clear. Both the IDF and Hezbollah took a beating fighting each other. And that's what's so interesting about what's happened in Syria, because as soon as that ended under the so-called ceasefire, which is nothing more than a tenuous pause in the war, suddenly we get this ISIS mercenary force paid for by the United States, Turkey, and sponsored and supported by the United States and Israel and Turkish military intelligence to run amok in Syria.
Right.
While the Russians are preoccupied with ending the war in Ukraine, and the Iranians are sitting at home preparing for an Israeli assault. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. It's amazing with the cabinet selections, whether you're talking about, and I'll just run through a few, Mike Huckabee, he won't recognize words like West Bank or Gaza. He says it's Judea and Samaria. Elise Stefanik, we're going to crush anti-Semitism at home and abroad, which I respect that if that's what it actually means. Like, let's get rid of racism. But I know that it's far more than that. You've got Nikki Haley signing warheads saying, finish them with hearts. Pete Hegseth saying there's no reason we can't build a third temple. It's unbelievable. And these are all the people that Trump is packing, not so much Nikki Haley, but throw in Kristi Noem then. He's
well,
packing.
You have to look, first of all, what kind of wealth do these people have? Huckabee's a multimillionaire.
Substantial.
Yeah, well, Huckabee, the pastor from Arkansas, the humble pastor from Arkansas, is a multimillionaire. Where did his wealth come from? Look at the sources. Okay. And then look at who owns the source. There's a lot of money and a lot of power on Wall Street in New York City.
Can you provide a more clear example of something? Because I would have said, well, Huckabee probably made a lot of money from his books and from being a political pundit on TV.
Well, anybody who comes on television routinely and has a book out is going to make money.
Right.
I certainly have. And I haven't really worked that hard to quote unquote market any of my books. But if you show up and you're on a major show like Tucker Carlson or any number of Fox News shows or CNN with Aaron, whatever her name is, I've forgotten. But the point is, if you show up on those shows with these books, you're going to make money. So you got to get on the show, though.
Right.
Who owns the show? Who funds it? Who are the producers? What are the corporate heads?
Yeah, the network all the way up to BlackRock.
Yeah, where do they go? Exactly. So, you've got to ask, where did the money come from? And was all of this earned by sweat of the brow? It reminds me, I had a non-commissioned officer, great guy, who was from West Virginia. And he watched me in the afternoon when I was a young officer, a captain. He said, "Where are you going, sir?" I said, "Well, I'm going to the gym." "Sir, if you did an honest day's work, you wouldn't have to go to the gym." I thought it was amusing, and everybody chuckled. There's a certain amount of truth in what he's saying. Apply it to the other side. In other words, think about where is this coming from? Why are some people getting very rich and others are not? Why are some people having their bank accounts closed? This is not a good setting right now in the United States. There is corruption of freedom of speech. There is a corruption of the Bill of Rights. There is a corruption of the private sector in partnership with bad actors inside our own governmental structure, CIA, defense, whatever it is. All of these things are interrelated. It's an ugly story, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time on it, but people are asking me, well, how did this happen? I always tell them, follow the money.
Yes. Great advice. Because I'm a Christian, I have a Christian community around me. They're very, very staunchly pro-Israel, and it will cost you something if you even bring up some of the topics I've brought up today, but I've gotten used to it. From your perspective, if you are talking to someone who maybe comes from the way I was a hardcore Zionist, I'm just going to support Israel no matter what, but they are willing to listen to a show like this and they want to be a little bit better informed. What is something you would read or a documentary that you would say, this is something you need to see or to read to understand a little bit more about the Middle East?
Well, you probably ought to go back to the book by Mearsheimer and Walt called The Israel Lobby.
Okay.
That's worth reading,
That's John Mearsheimer?
Yeah, Mearsheimer and Waltz. And I think Waltz is Jewish. Mearsheimer isn't, but Waltz is. And everybody who's Jewish is not part of the problem. This is the other unintended consequence of much of what's going on right now in this country. People start to lump people together in groups. If you can, one of my relatives used to say to me all the time, I was raised as a Quaker, don't hate in the plural.
Right.
If you don't like someone, that's fine, but don't hate in the plural. It's very important that we not hate in the plural. And unfortunately, I see this sort of thing emerging inside the United States as people begin to connect the dots. You mentioned BlackRock. Look at Disney. Look at all these firms. Who's running them?
Right.
Where's all this money come from? Why are they doing what they're doing? And you see that it's unambiguous. We know who's behind it and who's doing what to whom. It's scary. But what's more scary than anything else is this tendency to say collectively, oh, it's those people.
Yeah.
We don't want to go down that road. But at the same time, you have to look at where the money comes from. Okay. Now, as far as a hardcore Zionist, I was never a hardcore Zionist. I just thought Israel has a right to exist. I still do. And I think Israel has a very positive role to play, not just in the world at large, but also in that region. But unfortunately, what's happened now is made that almost impossible in the future. And I think there's just too much blood that's being spilled. I don't see this ending well for anybody.
Do you feel like Israel through this war has created brand new waves of generations of Islamic terrorism by the way they've gone about it?
Well, I think it has. And we have to admit that what we did in 2003 in the Middle East with Iraq and then subsequently Libya and eventually also in Afghanistan has created legions of people who are anti-Israeli. No question about it.
Yeah.
And anti-American now.
what is our best, because I want to end this on a positive, constructive note. I talked in the show opening about we want to problem solve. I understand you're saying it's nearly an impossible situation. I've heard Mearsheimer say the same thing recently. What is the United States best move at this point, both for the immediate and going forward in terms of this war?
Well, the American president has the executive authority to suspend a lot of this military aid that goes to Israel. And of course, he would be excoriated for doing that. But we have to understand that what's been happening now for the last year is not the defense of Israel. It's an offensive war to expand the power and dominance of Israel and its supporters in the region.
Mm-hmm.
We have to admit that first. If you admit that, then you ask the question, why are we doing it?
Right.
Now, some people will argue, well, Israel's a vanguard state. It's in the lead for Western or U.S. interests. I find that difficult to accept because it's alienating everyone in the whole region, in the whole Muslim world. I mean, you've now got Muslims excited in Jakarta over what's happening.
Mm.
When that kind of thing happens, you have to ask yourself, what's the price that everyone's paying? I think we have to look at BRICS. We have to look at Saudi Arabia that has now rejected a treaty with us and has made it abundantly clear they will no longer go along with us. And that's turning out to be the case increasingly for the Emirates and the Gulf. And remember, these are very wealthy powers, and we've depended upon them for influence in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And we've aligned ourselves with people that are anathema to the Muslim Arabs. Most Muslims have no use for this group called HTS, the offspring of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and so forth. Americans don't see that. Americans don't understand that what's emerging is almost a parallel universe involving most of the countries in the world that want to do business without us.
Mm-hmm.
This is not going to get any better in the near run. We've poisoned too many wells. But I would urge a review of what we're doing, because do we really want to align ourselves with the mass murder and expulsion of millions of people, whether they're Muslim Arabs or anything else? Doesn't make any difference. Is that something we want to harness the power and reputation of the United States to? Now, the Israelis don't care. For them, remember they've said these people are all Amalek. They're animals, barbarians.
Yes.
They deserve the worst.
Well,
so from their vantage point, this is perfectly fine and wonderful. But I don't think it is. I think if most Americans flew into the place and were taken on a tour of what's being done over there and would see what's happening, I don't think most Americans would support this at all.
Yeah, I agree. The PR thing from Netanyahu's government and even the Christian, mostly right wing, has been, hey, if they would just give up the hostages, if they'd give the hostages back to Israel, this would end tomorrow. And, my opinion, just quickly, is that these hostages have been very useful for Netanyahu to continue his expanse and do what he's doing, because as long as they're not back, he gets to continue to plow down these surrounding areas. Am I right or wrong?
Oh, no, I think so. It helps justify his broader war. So the last thing he probably wants at this stage is for that to be remedied. In other words, the release of the hostages, and many Israelis would say, well, that's enough. Let's back off. Not everybody, but a lot of Israelis would say that. Right now, he still has the support of 80% of the Israeli population. That is his policies. They don't like him, but they do generally support his policies. That's the bad news.
Okay. Well, what would be your advice to the civilians like myself who are aware of, what you've said on this show, and it seems pretty bleak, maybe more bleak in the Middle East? What should our mentality be? What can we do? Is there anything? Because I want to leave people with, something constructive.
Well, someone said the truth will set you free.
Mm.
And my view is that we should seek the truth. Let's discard the narratives and understand that they are just that. They're narratives. They're fairy tales. What comes through the mainstream media is a fraction of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we find the truth? You've got to dig for it. And you, Jeremy, and I know that most Americans are too busy to do that.
Yes.
They're trying to make a living. They want to put food on the table. They want to keep their families safe. But they have to look for the truth. And that's where you come in, and others like you, hundreds of thousands of people like you in the alternative media, because you are the source of the truth. And I do believe that truth is indestructible. It will always win out. As Shakespeare said in more than one of his plays, the truth will out. It will come out. It doesn't always come out soon enough. I remember when we finally pulled out of Vietnam and people actually stood there and said with a straight face, oh, we killed perhaps 250,000 Vietnamese. Today, I've seen estimates of 2 million.
Oh, man. Yeah.
We lied about what was actually happening in Vietnam. And anybody who said, wait a minute, this is stupid. What's the objective? What's the goal here? Why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you were out. That's the way Washington works. You must adopt the narrative. And you keep saying what is not true until you can't say it anymore, and then you change the subject.
That's right. Yeah.
And believe me, I think that will happen in Ukraine first. It'll become patently obvious that this is a strategic failure on a scale that we have seldom witnessed in the history of our country. NATO is not going to last. The EU will crumble. The ramifications of this war are not even felt yet in the United States.
Yes.
I also think we're going to be wallowing in the middle of a terrible financial crisis. It may even look like a depression at some point. You've got plenty of analysts out there warning about it. You know, I hear people say, well, we're cutting interest rates. We're cutting interest rates, but bond yields continue to rise. What's wrong with that picture? We don't control the interest rates anymore.
Right.
So when we can't control the interest rates, and we can't, as they rise, what does that do to our repayment system on the debt? What does that do to our credit worthiness as a nation? What does that do to our economy when we're paying as much in debt servicing every year as we spend on national defense and the intelligence agencies? That's over $1 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, well, that can go on. That can go on. And that's because we're the reserve currency. And anybody who doesn't want our dollars, we'll go ahead and punish you. That's not going to work. Do the numbers. There are 132 nation states in the world today. Look at the ones who are in BRICS right now, seven or so, and the 84 that are lined up to join.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that suggest about who's got the body of people and economies? India, China, Russia, Iran. These are very large countries with big economies.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing? We're isolating ourselves, not winning anything.
I know you've got to run here. Do you see the BRICS nations and all that realignment? Do you look at that as the bad guys, as evil?
No.
Okay.
No. If we're going to insist on that, we've done more to create BRICS than anybody.
Yeah.
Because of our financial system, the SWIFT system. You got to use our payment system. You got to use our dollars. If you don't, we punish you. We've used the IMF, the World Bank, all these institutions to tell people what crops they will grow, what they will develop and export. What's that sound like? It sounds like the British Empire.
Yeah.
You know, we don't want to be an empire. But at the same time, Washington very much wants to be an empire. They want to be in a position to tell everyone else what to do. Well, here we are. Welcome to the world. The world does not want to be told what to do anymore.
That's right.
We've squandered our reputations and I would say our capital in all the wrong ways and all the wrong things.
It sounds to me
bribe, bully, or bomb. Those are the three options: bribe, bully, or bomb. That's America.
It sounds to me like the Sebastian Gorkas and even Donald Trumps and the others of the world need to think long term. And what you said, the truth will set you free, because greed and money is a short term benefit, but it sounds to me like it could bring some long term pain if we continue down this road. So I really appreciate.
There's no doubt about it. But you know, it's back to what we talked about at the beginning. We think of ourselves as the center of the universe. Well, we were the center of the universe after World War II, when we accounted for more than 50% of global gross domestic product. Think about that.
Right.
Today, we represent 25%.
Mm.
Things have changed.
Yep.
So we're one of many. We're not unique, and everyone else is not subordinate to us. We have to adjust our thinking and adapt. It's not hard. We can do it. And if we focus on what we do best, which is to build prosperity, we will be the leading power in 10 years instead of just one of several great powers. Washington said it best when he left office. He said, "Give us peace for 20 years, and we will become so powerful economically that no nation on the world will challenge us."
That's a good
He
word.
was right.
Well, speaking of truth and free speech, tell me and tell my audience about Republic, and then I've got a short clip to play on that.
Okay, good. Well, I'm the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, which is an organization that was formed by a lot of people that believe in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And we're very concerned about key issues. Number one, end these overseas involvements with the U.S. military. They're self-defeating and counterproductive. Restore the rule of law. Secure the border. These things are at the top. End the human trafficking, especially the trafficking of children, and ultimately the sexualization of children in our schools. Those are key issues that we've organized around. And defend against globalism. This seems like a crazy statement to people that haven't looked at it, but globalism is the antithesis of everything we believe in. It's COVID on steroids, and far worse policies. And along came, after a couple of years of very hard work by a lot of good people, this platform called Republic. I say it's a platform. It's a social media platform. And it was designed from the very beginning to be a free speech platform. And I've led my organization, Our Country, Our Choice, onto the platform for precisely that reason, because you will not be censored. Whoever you are, if you go on that platform and you go on by simply saying, "This is who I am," you don't even have to give your real name, put in your zip code, and then suddenly everything happening in your area will be made clear to you. In other words, who's the sheriff, who's the congressman, who's the state representative, because we believe that the best way to change things is from the ground up. We also would like to see change from the top to the bottom, and we hope that maybe what happens is that you meet in the middle at some point. But you've got to have change bubbling up. So you've got to have people in positions of authority, county sheriff, mayor, governor. Those people have to be in a position to do what we, the American people, want them to do. Protect our way of life, protect our children, protect our society, protect our culture, and so forth.
Amen. That sounds awesome.
Now, that's what it's about. But when you go on Republic, remember, if you just want to read what's there, it's free. You can go on and page through whatever is there. But if you want to have the ability to take action, in other words, influence something, then you have to pay $180 for a year's access, or there's a discount code, and I think it's on your screen. I can't see it.
It is. Yes, sir.
That discount code gives you 30% off. That saves you $60. So you're down to $120. And we've had that initially all as a lump sum, but we're now looking at making it a monthly payment exercise. But right now it's a lump sum. And that seems like a lot. $120 is no small fee for most of us. But it really isn't a big sum, because you look at all the money you spend on everything else, cable TV,
Right.
and access to sports and ESPN and so forth. But more important, this gives you a chance to go on there if you pay, and you have essentially action tools. You see something wrong in your neighborhood. In other words, give you a quick example. A friend of mine saw in the middle of the night busloads of illegals coming into his neighborhood and being offloaded at various motels. And he went up to the federal sheriff who was there, who was a federal marshal, and said, "What is this?" And he said, "Well, these people are, they're migrants." He said, "Where they come from?" "Well, they came from the Texas border or somewhere else, and they're from all over, blah, blah, blah." So, well, wait a minute. Nobody asked us if we wanted these people in our area. How are we supposed to maintain them? Well, they're going to have health care. Where? Well, in your area, they're going to have health care. We're going to pay for their health care, even though you, as an American citizen, may not have health care. We're going to provide health care to these migrants. And he sort of stood there and said, well, this is crazy. How do I inform people of what's going on? Republic as a platform is your opportunity. You can post a video of what you're seeing. You can post what you think, and then you can hit a button with the tools that are there and send that to everyone who represents you in your state, all the way up to the federal level. In other words, it's no longer a secret. Why do they bust them around in the middle of the night and offload them in the night? Well, we all know it's illegal.
Right.
This is the government acting against us and our best interests. You're not going to be thrown off. You will not be censored. Now, this is also true for Nancy Pelosi. If she wants to pay the fee and go on there and create a space and push her propaganda, she can do it. The only people that will be thrown off are people who advocate for the overthrow of our government or are pornographic. And we ask people, listen, try to avoid the expletives, no matter how mad you are about something. That doesn't help your case anyway.
Sure.
But we're not censoring and we're not throwing anybody off except for those two things. And this becomes a means of communication for you as a citizen. You can now talk to everybody who agrees with you, as well as people that don't. In other words, you'll also have a list of all the various organizations, entities in the country that are interested in what you are. True the Vote, you've heard of them?
Yes.
They're on there. You can go right to their website. You're upset about the election or what you saw. You believe in electoral integrity. You can post what you think and then go bang straight to their point. If you see children that are missing in your area, little girls that are 4, 5, 6 years of age who've disappeared, nobody's ever found them, you can go on, post everything about it, and you will find advocacy organizations that are linked to us that you can go to. You can also send what you think or what you've videoed to all the social media platforms from Republic.
Okay.
There is no corporate advertising on Republic.
Could I upload a video of
hostage to corporate money?
Could I upload a video of this size to the?
Yes.
Excellent.
You can upload everything. There is no limitation. We can handle 500 million people.
Okay. That sounds like a heck of a deal.
That's what I've been told. And we're using it at Our Country, Our Choice for that reason. This is I sometimes talk to people about the committees of correspondence that existed in all of the colonial Congress. Remember that, we had governments modeled on the British government, parliamentary system. And in each of the colonies grew so-called committees of correspondence. These were people that supported revolutionary change in the United States, essentially independence.
Okay.
Everything that happened was transmitted between these committees of correspondence all up and down the East Coast, from Maine all the way down to the border with Florida. That's how we communicated. That's how we knew what was happening, because the British certainly weren't going to tell us what was going on, especially if it was not favorable to them. That's the way I see Republic. This is a highway for the truth.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like quite a platform. I'm going to sign up today.
And I especially urge churches.
Okay.
And I don't care what your religion is. People say, well, what about Muslims? Look, unless you're an advocate for Sharia law and polygamy, you're fine. You can use this platform to promote whatever you want. Same thing for Buddhists. Same thing for anybody. I mean, that's free speech.
Absolutely. Well, Colonel, I really appreciate your insights today. It has been awesome. I look forward to having you back on. Hopefully you'll come back on when we talk about geopolitical matters.
You never know. They may show up at our door and arrest both of us before we're through. But it's for a good cause.
There you go. Well, thank you again, sir. And I'm going to finish up with playing a little educational video about Republic, and look forward to having you back.
Good. Thank you.
All right.
Fellow Americans, our nation, our republic is at a crossroads.
And our system is broken.
We are no longer a government by the people and for the people.
We're something else now. In today's age, we fear the government. We feel gaslit. We feel controlled.
Our free speech has been censored.
Our faith is attacked.
And lies are spread far and wide.
This is why Republic was created, to restore the tools that have been lost.
To inform, organize, and act. But it's all up to you.
Not others.
You.
Only you.
It's time to take back our republic, one town at a time.
As a nation, we don't always agree on everything, but we do agree on one thing: our freedom.
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 Freedom. Freedom.
Freedom. Every American who cares about the truth needs to join Republic.
This is our moment. This is our stand. This is how we rebuild,
Rekindle,
And restore our republic.